Opening the center, this pawn advance immediately contests crucial central squares and prepares development. Asserting central control immediately, 1. d5 mirrors white's ambition, aiming for a solid, symmetrical pawn structure and immediate influence over the d4 square. Developing this knight aims for central influence and prepares castling, subtly contesting black's pawn. Developing the knight here harmonizes with the central pawn and prepares for queenside counterplay, a natural continuation to this queen's pawn opening. This bishop sortie immediately contests the center and prepares for queenside expansion, subtly hinting at future attacking prospects. Developing the knight to d7 prepares for a potential e5 break, contesting the center and creating a solid defensive structure. Solidifying the center's presence, this knight hop reinforces pawn control while preparing for potential kingside castling, subtly increasing piece harmony. Fortifying the center with c6 solidifies black's pawn structure, preparing for potential queenside expansion and creating a stable base for future development. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling, this move patiently supports the knight and eyes the e4 square for future expansion. Solidifying the d5 pawn and preparing development, this move embraces a more restrained approach, aiming for a robust pawn structure. Asserting bishop influence along the long diagonal, this placement aims to prepare kingside castling while subtly pressuring black's central structure, potentially setting up a future e4 push if black doesn't adequately counter the growing piece activity. Instead of reinforcing the kingside pawn structure, black challenges the bishop's outpost, creating an immediate decision for white that could lead to pawn structure imbalances or a bishop trade that simplifies the position. Securing the monarch amidst the developing skirmish is paramount, creating a safe harbor for the king and enabling active piece deployment from the wings. Preventing the bishop's discomfort, this prophylactic retreat shores up the kingside pawn structure, subtly creating a sanctuary for the monarch while preparing for potential counterplay. Anticipating a potential queenside expansion, white strategically repositions the queen to support a future central push and prepare for castling on the other flank if needed, while also potentially eyeing a kingside attack later. Securing the king with castling now creates a solid defensive structure, tucking away the monarch behind a pawn shield and bringing the rook into play for future action, harmonizing with the developing pieces. A bold central push, dramatically reshaping the pawn structure and opening lines for white's pieces, creating immediate tension that black must carefully address. Sacrificing the bishop pair now might be an attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for piece activity on the queen side, though it concedes a slight positional advantage in the long run. Opening the b-file provides a pathway for the rook, potentially activating it later, but it creates an isolated d-pawn and weakens the pawn structure on the queen side. This decision sacrifices the pawn's defensive solidarity for piece activity. Consider the long-term implications for controlling the center and defending the king. Recapturing with the pawn immediately opens the d-file for your rook, a crucial avenue that was previously blocked by white's pawn. This dynamic shift now presents opportunities to challenge white's central control and potentially create weaknesses on their queen side. Consider how this action influences the board's spatial balance and the interplay of your remaining pieces. Reclaiming that central square with the bishop, white opens a diagonal towards black's uncastled king, though for now it's a rather peaceful exchange. This recapture reasserts white's pawn structure after the previous capture, preparing to activate the dark-squared bishop to a more commanding diagonal, perhaps eyeing the kingside if black isn't careful. The resulting pawn shape now offers white more central control and a potentially stronger outpost for their pieces. The knight's redeployment to e4 immediately challenges white's centralized bishop and sets up a potential exchange that could simplify the position while also creating a target for black's remaining pieces. Reclaiming the queen swiftly secures the central pawn majority and eyes the kingside, creating immediate attacking potential. Re-establishing the knight's presence centrally, the black steed gracefully retreats from its temporary outpost, seeking a more secure and active role, while simultaneously preparing to contest the d4 pawn and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses created by white's pawn structure. Consolidating the queen to a central outpost on d3 immediately prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm and offers better support for the d4 pawn, while simultaneously unpinning the knight and freeing up the f3 bishop. The knight boldly ventures into the center, challenging white's central pawn majority and eyeing the vulnerable queenside. Securing the bishop's retreat while creating a subtle, long-term pressure point on the queenside, this move aims to consolidate white's pawn structure before launching a more decisive central action. The knight retreats, sacrificing valuable central space and relinquishing the immediate threat to white's queen, but it clears the way for the f-pawn to potentially advance, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain some breathing room on the kingside. This maneuver might seem passive, but it carefully prepares a strategic redeployment, hoping to find a more active outpost on the queenside or perhaps support a future queenside pawn push. Consider the subtle implications for the d-file and the long-term influence on the central squares. Bringing the rook to the central file establishes a powerful presence, preparing to challenge black's central control and potentially open lines for attack. A bold relocation of the knight, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square, potentially the f4 or e5 outpost, while simultaneously challenging white's queen and creating opportunities for queenside expansion. This maneuver, though seemingly passive at first glance, cleverly sidesteps immediate tactical confrontations and instead focuses on building a more robust defensive structure before considering an offensive push. The knight's journey to g6 might appear circuitous, but it sets the stage for future strategic advantages, perhaps by clearing the path for a pawn advance on the kingside or preparing a coordinated attack on the central pawns. Activating the knight towards the center, aiming to disrupt black's comfortable pawn structure and create dynamic possibilities. Exchanging the knight on e5 immediately resolves the tension in the center, simplifying the position and opening up lines for your pieces that were previously blocked, potentially leading to better activity for your rook on f8. Reclaiming the e-file with the rook signifies a direct challenge to black's central pawn and immediately opens lines for white's other pieces, aiming to exploit the king's potential exposure later. Unleashing a pawn thrust like this, while creating immediate activity, risks weakening the king's protective pawn chain and opens a diagonal for white's bishop, potentially leading to a loss of central control if black isn't prepared to defend and develop rapidly. A subtle repositioning, this rook retreats, vacating a vital square for its knight while preparing to support a potential queenside pawn push, subtly aiming to control the e-file and restrict black's dark-squared bishop. Liberating the kingside pawn structure to launch a counterattack on white's central pawns, though it does leave the f7 square somewhat exposed to potential future incursions from white's bishop. Aggressively pushing the rook to the kingside, this move initiates a potent pawn storm aimed directly at black's monarch, potentially sacrificing material for a decisive attack. Unleashing the queen like a thunderbolt, this move instantly electrifies the kingside, threatening a direct assault on white's vulnerable king. Opening a vital diagonal towards black's vulnerable monarch, white unleashes a daring raid. The exchange on e5, followed by the rook's aggressive repositioning, is a fascinating gamble to exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king. White's pieces now converge on the h-file, creating immediate pressure and forcing black to make defensive concessions. Consider the potential for a swift mating attack if black isn't vigilant. This aggressive posture, while potentially risky, forces black onto the back foot, disrupting their intended positional development. The rook's presence on the h-file, supported by the queen, presents a direct threat that requires a precise and timely response. The queen, having found a precarious home on h4, now seeks a more stable position, potentially aiming to support a pawn push or reroute to a more influential square. Reasserting control of the central e-file, this piece repositions to challenge black's recently doubled pawns and prepare for potential pawn pushes that could open lines towards the king. Attempting to bolster the queenside with this rook sortie, black overlooks the immediate vulnerability of their king, now exposed to a potential storm brewing on the kingside. The bishop's diagonal control is re-established, aiming to pry open lines towards black's king and potentially challenge the dark squares that have become a bit comfortable for the black pieces, especially after the recent pawn pushes. Emboldening the knight and preparing its retreat to a more secure square, this development also aims to connect the rooks and unblock the c8 square for potential future piece maneuvering, creating a more unified defensive structure. Re-establishing pressure on the g-file, white aims to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's queen and bishop, potentially preparing a kingside assault if black isn't careful about king's safety. Securing the bishop on e8 offers a degree of safety, but it relinquishes the diagonal that was pressuring white's queenside pawn structure. This retreat invites white to consolidate their central pawn majority and potentially expand on the kingside, further cramping black's position. Pushing the c-pawn now significantly impacts the central structure, aiming to create a passed pawn by potentially exchanging on d5 or e6, while simultaneously bolstering white's kingside presence by preparing for a subsequent b4 advance to control the queenside space. Sensing an opportunity to unburden the queenside and disrupt white's central pawn structure, black redirects the queen, preparing to potentially challenge the open c-file or redeploy for defensive duties. Reactivating the rook on the e-file aims to build pressure on the kingside, potentially exploiting the slightly exposed black king if the defensive pawn structure weakens further, while also preparing to contest the central open files. Opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop now, aiming to challenge white's centralized pieces and potentially create an outpost for the knight on d5. Opening up the e-file for potential rook infiltration is the immediate payoff, but more subtly, this bishop repositions to eye the kingside and prepare for a potential queenside pawn storm by solidifying the center. Shifting the rook to the g-file initiates a fascinating offensive idea, immediately putting pressure on white's kingside and eyeing potential weaknesses that have developed. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure creates a defensive shield, preparing for potential future pawn advances, or simply adding robustness to white's king's safety as the position becomes more congested. A sensible reorientation, preparing to contest the central files and potentially shift the battleground toward the queenside. Unlocking a latent kingside attack, this maneuver cleverly repositions the queen to a central attacking hub, probing for weaknesses in black's slightly passive pawn structure, and preparing to potentially exploit the open g-file should the situation permit. Breaking open the queenside with this pawn advance aims to disrupt white's positional grip and create counterplay, potentially targeting the now somewhat exposed white king and opening lines for black's pieces. Breaking open the queenside now, white aims to exploit the slight awkwardness of black's pieces and create immediate tactical possibilities, potentially opening lines for their rooks while forcing a decision on the c-file's fate. Opening the c-file suddenly presents a dynamic counterplay opportunity, leveraging the advanced pawn to potentially disrupt white's queenside structure and create new avenues for your pieces. Securing the c-file for potential penetration, this maneuver aims to exploit the pawn structure black has fostered, potentially creating weaknesses around their king. Challenging the central tension, this rook arrives to contest the c-file, eyeing the potential for counterplay against white's slightly exposed king and asserting a presence along an open pathway. Relocating the rook to the third rank aims to reinforce the defense of the e3 pawn and prepare for potential coordination with the other rook, perhaps by swinging it over to the c-file to challenge black's control. This maneuver also frees up the bishop on d2, allowing it to potentially redeploy for a more active role. Unleashing a rook to the fourth rank immediately injects dynamism into the position, creating a fascinating interplay of counterpressure against white's central pawn structure and a potential siege on the queenside. This bold maneuver aims to activate a dormant piece and contest the open c-file, forcing white to confront immediate threats and perhaps disrupting their previously harmonious setup. It's a declaration that black is not content to passively defend and seeks to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's coordination. A calculated exchange opens up the center, aiming to simplify the position and potentially target the exposed black kingside structure, a bold decision that embraces potential complexity over passive play. The pawn structure is about to undergo a significant alteration, and this capture dramatically opens the b-file, presenting dynamic possibilities for black's rook and potentially creating passed pawns down the road. Shifting the queen to attack the b-pawn after the capture on c4 reestablishes pressure and threatens to open up lines for white's pieces. Finally, a moment to regroup and assess the chaotic landscape, seeking a more stable position for the queen after that frantic exchange. Seizing the open c-file, white immediately puts pressure on black's compromised pawn structure, threatening to unravel the defensive setup and create immediate tactical opportunities. Initiating a pawn advance on the queen side to open lines and potentially create a passed pawn offers a dynamic response to white's recent capture, aiming to exploit the weakened structure of the queen side and activate the misplaced bishop. Strategically reinforcing the c-file to pressure black's queenside pawns offers white a crucial positional advantage, aiming to exploit the newly opened lines for piece activity and ultimately disrupt black's pawn structure. Safeguarding the monarch amidst the impending chaos on the queen side is paramount. Relocating to the h7 square offers a slight improvement in evasion possibilities should the b-file become a thoroughfare for enemy attack. Initiating a subtle pawn advance aims to solidify the kingside's defensive structure and create a sanctuary for the monarch. This is a subtle attempt to activate the bishop, aiming to bring it off the crowded queen side and potentially participate in the central struggle, while also creating a little more space for the king. Securing that queenside pawn structure from a potential g5 advance or a kingside pawn storm now becomes a priority, preventing any immediate tactical breakthroughs. Disrupting the rhythm, this bishop's sortie aims to untangle black's pieces and potentially create counterplay by offering exchanges, forcing white to reconsider their queenside pressure. Re-establishing the queen's pressure on the queenside now forces black to defend the advanced pawn structure, preventing any easy breakthrough. The queen repositions, seeking more active diagonals and potentially targeting white's doubled pawns on the c-file, while simultaneously providing a defensive screen for the king by occupying a square on the same color complex. Liberating the rook from its back rank confinement, this maneuver aims to activate its latent power and potentially spearhead a new attacking initiative on the open c-file, disrupting black's currently solid, albeit somewhat passive, setup and forcing a concrete reaction. Re-engaging the bishop with bc6 aims to maintain a foothold on the queenside and potentially prepare for k5 or qb7, while the rook on c4 is still a significant threat and the pawn structure remains quite solid. The pawn push opens a critical diagonal for your queen, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the queenside and potentially create mating threats or force exchanges that favor white's initiative. Sacrificing the bishop opens a fascinating tactical skirmish. While material is exchanged, the immediate threat to white's king on the h-file, coupled with black's newly activated queenside pawns, creates significant dynamic imbalances that demand precise calculation. Solidifying the pawn chain now prevents black's queen from finding active squares on the file and prepares to reinforce the king's defense. The queen sacrifices its tempo, retreating to a square where it can potentially coordinate with the rook on the b-file and threaten pawn structures. But it allows white's queen to solidify its central presence and potentially advance the passed pawn on the c-file if supported. Clearing the path for the king offers a much-needed escape route from the encroaching enemy queen and bishop, while simultaneously preparing to support a pawn advance or potentially redeploy the king to a safer square later in the game. Shifting the bishop to the edge seems passive, potentially allowing white's queen greater freedom to roam and create threats on the queenside or center. Trading queens simplifies the position and brings the endgame into focus. White aims to exploit black's potentially weakened queenside pawn structure and the exposed king. Capturing the pawn on b6 immediately simplifies the position, ushering in an endgame where pawns on the file become crucial targets, and black's king might find itself a bit exposed on the queenside. Establishing a passed pawn on the queenside is the primary objective now, as white aims to create a dangerous threat to black's king in the endgame. Unleashing a pawn thrust, black aims to gain vital space on the queenside and challenge white's dominant central pawns, potentially opening lines for their rook. Securing the pawn on the kingside is a sensible step, preventing immediate counterplay from black's bishop and knight, which are poised to advance. Bringing the rook back into the fray activates a dormant piece and immediately challenges the queenside pawn structure, creating immediate tactical possibilities and disrupting white's intended pawn push. King's safety is paramount, and your monarch is currently exposed to black's active pieces, particularly the bishop on g4. Shifting the king towards the center, even with the pawn moves, creates immediate defensive responsibilities. Securing the bishop on g2 offers a valuable defensive outpost, preventing any immediate harassment of the king from that diagonal and simultaneously preparing to support a future pawn push or even a sortie for the queen. Activating the king to support the queenside pawns seems like a reasonable attempt to consolidate the position and prepare for potential pawn pushes. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount. Shifting the king towards the center now will allow it to actively participate in the upcoming endgame, offering better defensive and offensive capabilities than leaving it exposed on the flank. Propelling the king forward now aims to activate this piece, transforming it from a defensive liability into an offensive asset in the emerging endgame. Activating the monarch offers a glimmer of hope for maneuverability amidst the encroaching pawns and potential discovered attacks, aiming to eventually support the passed b-pawn and explore the queenside. Activating the bishop from its passive square shores up the kingside and prepares to contest the open files, potentially eyeing deeper penetration into black's weakened pawn structure. The king ventures into the open, seeking activity in what appears to be a simplified, albeit unbalanced, position. Its newfound liberty may be a double-edged sword. The rook slides to the 7th rank, establishing an outpost that aggressively pressures black's queenside pawns and limits the mobility of the bishop. Unleashing a pawn storm now could shatter white's defensive structure, but it risks weakening your own king's sanctuary, a bold, double-edged decision given the cramped position. Seizing the opportunity presented by black's misplaced bishop, white initiates a decisive counterplay by capturing the advanced pawn, forcing a crucial exchange, and simplifying the position towards a favorable endgame. Sacrificing the rook for pawn advancement dramatically alters the material balance, aiming to activate the kingside pawns and create a passed threat, though it leaves the remaining king dangerously exposed to the opponent's rook. King's retreat to safety, a prudent step given the unleashed attacking potential of black's rook and bishop now that white's pawn structure is fractured. Grabbing the rook is the only sensible response, as allowing it to remain on that advanced square would lead to an immediate and catastrophic collapse of your defenses. Capturing the bishop on g2 unleashes a crucial pawn on the kingside, which will now become a formidable weapon in this endgame, demanding immediate attention and potentially forcing black into a passive defensive posture. The pawn advances, seeking a wider sphere of influence and potentially preparing a breakthrough on the kingside to liberate the otherwise passive king. Repositioning the rook to the h-file immediately threatens to overwhelm the pawn structure and exploit the exposed monarch. Focusing on the immediate threat, this pawn's relentless march is poised to create a passed pawn on the king's flank, forcing white to dedicate resources to its containment and potentially opening lines for black's rook. Unlocking the g-file with this push is a bold attempt to create a passed pawn, but it leaves your king dangerously exposed and the pawn on h4 critically weak.